Pregnancy, a time of such joy for some, such admiration for your body and excitement for what parenting will bring, but also for some crippling anxiety, weird aches, pains and cravings, and the prospect that you actually have to give birth to this baby at some point. Pregnancy can be a really strange period of your life and can feel so different for so many people. Season 2 of Bun in the Oven is here to help you navigate this bonkers time, alongside me, Holly Grant, whilst I also navigate this bonkers time during my current second pregnancy. In this season of the podcast, I'm joined by experts in all areas of maternal and perinatal health in real time throughout this pregnancy to cover topics that mean you don't have to spend hours on Google, down a rabbit hole with no real evidence-based answer at the end of it all. I've worked with thousands of women over the last 11 years, and specifically since launching the Bump Plan in 2020. I've heard everything and admitted everything, so don't worry, we cover the embarrassing, gross stuff that you're not sure you want to ask your best friend. See, this is the information you wish you knew before you even knew you needed it. I can't wait for you to join me on this journey as we work out what on earth we're doing together. Enjoy Season 2. In today's episode of Bun in the Oven, I'm talking to one of my absolute favourite pelvic health physios and all-round superwoman, Emma Brockwell, all about how to look after your pelvic floor during and after pregnancy. Currently, I'm 22 weeks pregnant and definitely trying to stay on top of my pelvic floor training this time around. I struggled with stress incontinence during my first pregnancy with Freya and found it a real shock. I spend my life telling women to do their pelvic floor exercises, yet I hadn't in any way prioritised it myself. So when I was sat in a cafe waiting for a meeting, I sneezed and leaked. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Sadly, it's pretty common, but the good news is there's a lot we can do to prevent it. So in today's episode, Emma and I will discuss how you can look after your pelvic floor throughout your pregnancy journey. We explain exactly what the pelvic floor is, what happens to it during pregnancy and labour, and how we can boost the health and tone of our pelvic floor, what prolapse is and how to manage it, and when to seek help from a professional. Emma and I have worked together in various capacities for many years. She is a passionate pelvic health physiotherapist, author of the book Why Did No One Tell Me?, co-host of the fantastic podcast At Your Cervix, sits on the Scientific Clinical Advisory Board of the Active Pregnancy Foundation, and is a passionate runner and a mother too. This episode is ideal for you if you're currently pregnant, work with pregnant people, are recently postnatal, or are worried you may be suffering with some level of pelvic floor dysfunction. Pelvic floor dysfunction is a topic that is far less taboo than it has been previously, with social media and female tech brands helping to raise awareness of the issue, but there are still people out there nervous to ask for help. We hope this episode helps you better understand such an important part of your body and helps you seek help if you need it.
And now, ahead of this episode, a few words from our sponsor.
Given the theme of this podcast, I imagine that some of you are currently pregnant or planning a family. So many women I know just aren't sure how to move their body safely during this changing time, or they want to stay active but need someone to show them the way and hold their hand. That's where the Bump Plan Pregnancy comes in. The Bump Plan Pregnancy is a holistic prenatal fitness plan that allows you to work out with confidence at each trimester of your pregnancy. Founded by myself, Holly Grant, the Bump Plan Pregnancy has already helped over 25,000 pregnant women stay active safely and feel empowered throughout their pregnancies. Through its trimester-specific workouts, in which I'm always at the same stage of my pregnancy as you will be in yours, extensive education hub, discount hub and growing Facebook community, you'll feel supported and part of a welcome community. Let me help you move safely through your pregnancy, maintain your fitness and strength, and enter parenthood strong and prepared for all the demands it poses. As a listener of Bun in the Oven, I'm offering you 20% per month off the cost of your monthly subscription to the Bump Plan, simply by entering the code BUN20 at checkout. To get started today, simply head to pilatespt.co.uk/the-bump-plan and enter the code BUN20 at checkout. That's BUN20 in lowercase to get 20% off the monthly cost of the Bump Plan Pregnancy. Join our community today and enter labour and motherhood strong, capable and prepared with the Bump Plan. Hi Emma, it's so lovely to see you.
Oh, thanks for having me, Holly. Lovely to catch up with you.
You're welcome. I mean, we've done so many things together over the years already anyway, so it's just, I swear, sometimes it's just a nice opportunity to get to hang out with you.
It's the only time we get to catch up.
I know. To anyone listening, we've actually spent the last 15 minutes off camera just chatting, so that you guys didn't have to listen to all of the boring, mundane chit-chat. I always like to start these podcasts with kind of a bit of reality, I guess, to show people that not everyone has all of their shit together, I guess. So for me, Emma, this morning, Freya woke up at 4:10. And I mean, to be honest, recently she's been waking up at about 5:30, 6:00, which is doable. But I think unless you're going on holiday, waking up with a 4 at the beginning of that time is just absolutely brutal. So I think I've got my head screwed on. And I've anyone watching this, I've burst some blood vessels around my eye as well because I was sick on the way back from hospital. So I thought I'd got rid of all of that. But,
it's so brutal. And I always felt that 4:00 was it's a game changer as to how you feel by 3:00 in the afternoon the next day, or the same day if you like. But let me tell you, my kids are older now, so they're 9 and 7. And I really want to tell you that then they sleep through the night and all is well, but let me tell you, they don't. My son is a notoriously, he's a brilliant sleeper, but he always wakes up in the middle of the night and we have to walk into the toilet. He has to walk past the toilet to get to our bedroom. So he could actually just go to the toilet and go back to bed, but no, he comes all the way in. We have to walk into the toilet. We have to walk him back to bed. And then, of course, you can't get back to sleep. So it does get better, but it's just different, isn't it, as they get older? But sleep is still a bit of an issue, even though he's 9 and Martha is 7. So I shouldn't tell you this.
You almost need him to hit those hormones, don't you? Those teenage hormones, so that then actually you're fighting them to get up in the morning. That's what I'm holding out for.
Yes, but then, I have a stepdaughter who's 13. Do you know how irritating it is that she's still in bed at 10:30 and then she gets up and she hasn't tidied up anywhere, and you just have to really motivate them. So I don't know. I just think parenting is a minefield, and it gets easier in some ways, it gets harder in others.
So basically, when they go to university or they move out. I've got 18 years. So today, Emma, we are going to be talking all about how to look after your pelvic floor during pregnancy and postnatally. And I think that talking about pelvic floor dysfunction and the pelvic floor in general has definitely changed over the years. I think because of people like you and, social media where there's a lot more awareness, and, female tech companies that have done a really great job of, I guess, making a taboo topic a bit sexier, really, has changed a lot. But I do still think it's a bit of a taboo. And I remember, when I was pregnant with Freya, I can't remember how many weeks pregnant I was, but I think it was probably a similar to where I am now. And I was in a coffee shop waiting for a meeting, and I sneezed and I leaked. But I actually, wet myself. It wasn't just a tiny little leak. And I was so shocked, and I genuinely was thinking, I sort of laughed, and then I felt like crying. And I've spent so long, as of you, telling women, do your pelvic floor exercises, especially when you're pregnant, but then not actually prioritizing it myself. And I just couldn't believe that I was one of those people who was struggling with their pelvic floor. But it's actually really common, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think, the more people that talk about it, the more other people open up and say, oh yeah, I struggled as well. So I think it's really important that, we talk about the embarrassing stuff so that those who feel embarrassed are no longer embarrassed.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's this perception that because we're in this world, we won't have any pelvic floor issues. And we're all human. We are all vulnerable to experiencing dysfunction of our pelvic floor. And just to, caveat that with, you don't have to be pregnant or postnatal to have pelvic floor issues. If you're a woman and even a man, you can have pelvic floor issues. Women are more vulnerable simply because we have 3 holes in our pelvic floor as opposed to the men who have 2. But it's a muscle that's not really talked about. It's a muscle that we don't necessarily engage with until most of us get pregnant or have a baby. And by that time, that muscle can already be slightly weakened or compromised. So I guess I'm really passionate that we are getting it into education from an early age with girls and boys, but particularly with girls, that the pelvic floor is a muscle we should all be thinking of from a much younger age, whether or not we choose to have babies, but also highlighting that these signs and symptoms of pelvic floor dysfunction, like urinary leakage, are really common. And unfortunately they are. I would say around 1 in 2 women experience urinary incontinence, particularly after having a baby. But they're not normal. And, we should be way past the point of heading to a healthcare professional now and saying, well, I'm leaking urine when I've jumped on the trampoline with my little girl, and that healthcare professional turns around and says, well, you've had a baby, what do you expect? That's not a sufficient answer. And the best thing about most forms of pelvic floor dysfunction is that you can do something to get them better. Things that aren't that complicated, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yeah, and I think it's because we almost treat them like muscles that are different from the rest of the body, but actually they are muscles like any other group of muscle. And unless it's a prenatal fitness class or a postnatal fitness class, or you're very lucky, it's unlikely that as part of your exercise class that you go to at the gym or wherever you go, that you're going to be doing some specific pelvic floor exercises. So it's a part of the body that goes through an absolute battering, especially as a woman, periods, babies, sex, all that lot, but is completely forgotten about until, things are getting pretty tricky. So yeah, let's dive in then. So I think the first thing, Emma, is can we clear up what the pelvic floor actually is?
Yeah, so the pelvic floor, we tend to think of it, especially if we Google it, as a little strip of muscle that goes from our tailbone, our coccyx, to the front of our pelvis, the pubic bone. But actually, it's a pretty big muscle. If you put both of your hands together and cup them together in a bowl shape, that's roughly the size of the pelvic floor. And it's invaginated by 3 holes, as I touched on. So you have your anus, your vagina, and your urethra. To be clear, your urethra is where you pee from. Your vagina is where, if you have penetrative sex, you have penetrative sex. And if you deliver vaginally, that's where baby will come out of. And then obviously your anus or your back passage, which is where you would ordinarily open your bowels and pass wind. So there's 3 holes within that pretty big muscle. And it's not just about the muscle though, okay? So it's about all the ligaments, the fascia that connect into that muscle. So it's a big complex that we need to think about. It's not just a little strip of muscle, and it does need quite a lot of attention. But ultimately, its functions are phenomenal. It helps stop or helps us control poo and wee. It's really important for our sexual function. So the reality is, if you have a strong pelvic floor, you are more likely to have a better orgasm. That's a good selling point, I always think. And it supports...
Lead in with that one.
Yeah, I should have started with that. And then for women, it supports our pelvic organs, so our bladder, our bowel, our uterus. And it also helps with our pelvic stability and our the control around that middle part of our body. So it kind of blows my mind a little bit that we don't pay it a bit more attention, given the functions that it carries out are so vital to our everyday living.
Especially, I find it baffling because we put so much priority on other groups of muscles, right? So glutes, I mean, gosh, they're the sexy ones. Everyone's obsessed with glute exercises or, 6-pack abs. And if those muscles aren't working well, if they're weak or they're not functioning properly, yes, we might experience some pain or it might change our posture. But when the pelvic floor isn't working effectively, the kind of ramifications of that might be pain, they potentially changes to posture, I guess, but also a real change to your potential mental health, how comfortable you feel in the bedroom. There's some quite embarrassing symptoms, I guess, whilst they shouldn't be embarrassing, they might be. And so, yeah, it really should be top priority compared to some of the other sexier, more famous muscles that we have.
Yeah, but I suppose it's women and men are embarrassed that they leak urine or that they feel heaviness or bulging in the vaginal area. And it's really difficult to have that conversation, particularly if you're not being asked questions around that area. So I think as fitness professionals, healthcare professionals, medical professionals, we need to start the conversation. We need to ask women, are you experiencing those things? And honestly, once you ask the question, women are good to go. They're like, actually, yeah, I do. Especially then if you say, okay, well, that's pretty common, but it's not normal, so we can do something about that. And I do think women want to talk about these things, they just sometimes feel that they can't or they shouldn't, but that's entirely not the case, especially when it comes to like pelvic health physiotherapists. That's all we ever talk about. So we want to have those conversations because we want to help get you better. But the problem with the pelvic floor is it's a muscle you just cannot see. It's a muscle at the bottom of your pelvis, and because you can't see it, and because when it's all strong and lovely and working efficiently, it doesn't make you look any different necessarily, it's sometimes a hard sell. And unless you're getting pelvic floor pain or pelvic pain, often we can put up with these symptoms. Women unfortunately will pad up. They'll pop a pad into their underwear and maybe they'll continue going for a run, but they'll be leaking urine. And the reality is, if they keep doing that over time, they'll start leaking more and more and more. And the trend I seem to see is that you get to a point where you just don't want to do it anymore. So then it becomes a barrier to sport and exercise, which we know is so very important for our overall health and well-being, and that just becomes such a problem, which didn't need to be a problem if we could have ideally prevented any of those symptoms happening, or at least have treated them sooner when they were less impactful.
And I don't think there's ever a time where that's more the case than pregnancy. So obviously, you've talked about the functions of the pelvic floor, and I love that analogy of putting your hands together and kind of cupping them and imagining the pelvic floor. And if we do that and then imagine the sheer volume of weight that your pelvic floor is then carrying, even when you're not pregnant, because it's supporting the weight of your pelvic organs, because without your pelvic floor muscles, well, everything would fall out. And so then if we think about pregnancy, my gosh, your uterus is getting heavier and heavier and heavier. So let's talk a bit about what's actually happening to your pelvic floor during pregnancy then, and why did people start to notice things becoming an issue during pregnancy?
Yeah, so you've hit the nail on the head, really. Weight change, obviously, growing uterus, bump, growing baby, breasts get bigger, everything changes in our body. And what happens then is that pelvic floor muscle, which is a substantial muscle, but imagine that little, there's two hands full of muscles being under all of that load. It stands to reason that if we've never really addressed that area and considered strengthening it before, it stands to reason that we pile a lot of weight onto it, that it's going to potentially, be a repercussion, some symptoms from that. The other thing is hormones. Hormones do affect the pelvic floor, and because we have such dramatic hormonal changes during our pregnancy, of course that's going to impact the pelvic floor, and as a result of that is potentially where we also see some pelvic floor changes as well. Pregnancy is a time when your body changes so radically and so quickly that it kind of makes sense that there's going to be some compromise to our system, and that is really why it's so important that during pregnancy, ideally before pregnancy, we're thinking about our core, thinking about our pelvic floor, and really paying it some attention. And I just want to really highlight that if you're listening to this and you're pregnant and you're experiencing pelvic floor symptoms, that's okay. There is still something you can do to address that even during your pregnancy. And I think for a long time, there's been this misunderstanding that if you have pelvic floor issues during your pregnancy, that's kind of it. Wait till you've had baby and then address that. I would say if you're pregnant now listening and feeling symptomatic, see someone like a pelvic health physiotherapist to start addressing those symptoms sooner rather than later, because that really can make quite the difference.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And what would some of those symptoms be? I mean, we've obviously talked about urinary stress incontinence, but what other signs might there be that your pelvic floor is struggling during pregnancy?
So you might experience an increase in urinary urgency. The problem with that is, of course, where baby sits, right by your bladder, you end up going to the toilet a little bit more frequently anyway. And so that might just be where baby's positioned, as opposed to if you experience any true pelvic floor dysfunction. So urinary leakage, we touched on. Fecal leakage, unfortunately, you know, the back area of the pelvic floor supports the bowel, and when it becomes weaker, sometimes women can experience bowel incontinence, fecal incontinence, fecal urgency. But again, you've got all those hormonal changes that might be affecting that as well. Heaviness in the vagina, so you might start to notice some bulging, some actual change within the vaginal tissue where you notice some bulging, or a feeling of heaviness or discomfort, like there's something within the vagina that just doesn't feel comfortable. Pelvic pain, so that can be at the front, the sides, the back of your pelvis, going down into the hips, into the inner thighs. That could be a sign of some pelvic floor dysfunction. And painful sex as well. So if you're still having sex whilst you're pregnant and it's feeling uncomfortable, that could be because the pelvic floor is not as happy as it could be. And then, of course, we have something called obstructive defecation, which is just where you can't poo. You can't have a satisfying poo. And that can, again, just be because of changes within the pelvic floor and the bowel. That just means that some of your poo gets a little bit stuck, and you sometimes need to help support that area so as to clear your bowel more effectively. So all those symptoms sound terrifying, and they sound very unpleasant, and they really can be, but they can also be treated. And I keep saying it, and I know I keep saying it, but I just think I don't want to scaremonger anyone, because that's not the aim of this discussion, but it's really to highlight that if they are happening, then we need to really help you with those symptoms.
And most of those symptoms will be, if not fixable completely, they'll at least be, you'll be able to improve them slightly. So it's not like you're going to have that for the rest of your life. The good thing is because it's usually a muscular issue, some sort of attention to those muscles is going to make a big difference.
Yeah, it's certainly not going to do any harm by addressing the strength of the pelvic floor. And even, if you just sat here listening now, trying to start doing your pelvic floor exercises, that over time, remembering it's a muscle like any other muscle, it's not going to change overnight, over time can really, really make such a substantial difference. And if it doesn't, that's where you might just need a little bit more professional help. But maybe we'll cover that in a minute.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess this is probably a good opportunity to talk about the fact that we often think about when we have these symptoms that it must be that my pelvic floor is just like really weak and loose and it's just kind of not doing its job. But there is also an alternative, isn't there, where the pelvic floor is actually quite grippy, which is not necessarily going to be ideal if you're planning a vaginal birth. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I think it's nice to think of your pelvic floor, as we've touched on, like any other muscle. So to have a look at your arm right now, and if you straighten your arm fully, you've got a lovely straight arm, and then if you bend it fully, you've got a lovely bent elbow. So if you then just move that arm from a straight to a bent elbow, you've got some natural range of movement within that bicep that's allowing that to happen. Well, your pelvic floor is exactly the same. It extends and it contracts, or it relaxes and it contracts. That's a better way of putting it. And what some women are really quite good at is contracting the pelvic floor, but they're not so good at relaxing the pelvic floor. And that can be for a variety of reasons. It might be because you're nervous of experiencing these symptoms, that you tend to hold the pelvic floor subconsciously and almost hold it in the middle of its range. So a bit like looking at your elbow again and putting it halfway between a bent and a straight elbow. So you never quite relax it, you never quite contract it fully. It might be stress, anxiety, fear of being pregnant or of childbirth means that you just hold tension in that muscle, or because you're in pain. Women who experience pelvic girdle pain, unfortunately, often hold tension within that muscle, and that can be then felt as or contributing to the pain that you're experiencing. So often you've got to think about relaxing the pelvic floor, and I know you talk about this loads in the bump plan, as well as contracting the pelvic floor, because what you've got to remember is when you birth vaginally, if you birth vaginally, you are relaxing your pelvic floor because it's your uterus that's pushing baby out, and your pelvic floor that's relaxing, or your arm is straightening, to allow baby to be delivered vaginally. So it's really helpful during pregnancy, not just to focus on the strength component, but also to focus on the relaxation component, simply because, yes, we're thinking about contracting, getting nice and strong, to support your pelvic organs and baby whilst pregnant, but also then you need to learn the ability to relax your pelvic floor for if you have a vaginal delivery. And I want to caveat that with, even if you're planning a planned C-section, you really do need to know how to relax that pelvic floor, because baby might come along or have slightly different plans as to how they enter the world, and they may come along vaginally. So knowing that you can relax the pelvic floor is really helpful. But certainly postnatally, it's really important to know how to contract and relax. So it's a muscle like any other, and if you don't let it go, just like a stiff neck or a tight muscle in your back, it can be really painful and uncomfortable, and therefore that's worth considering when you're starting to rehab or train your pelvic floor.
And I think that one of the issues that we probably have is that, we're pregnant. We've heard somebody say that we need to train our pelvic floor. There's lots of things on social media where people try and give you inspiration as to when you could do your Kegels or your pelvic floor exercises. And often I'll see people saying, oh, every time I stop at a red light, I'll do my squeezes. Yeah. Or, when I'm washing up the pots, I'll do my squeezes. And the problem with that is that you wouldn't go to the gym and, start doing squats and then halfway through a squat, carry on, driving your car. And so if you're sat at a red light and you're focusing on doing your squeezes and then all of a sudden the light goes green, you're halfway through squeezing, you haven't thought about the relaxation section. And so as much as we're always trying to carve out time, we're always trying to think, how can I multitask? How can I squeeze in, no pun intended, my pelvic floor exercises? But I think my biggest piece of advice would be ideally try and carve out time where you're not doing other stuff at the same time, especially if you think that you might have a pelvic floor that's quite grippy, so that you're able to think about the lifting of the pelvic floor, whatever visualization you use, which we can talk about in a moment, but then you're still remembering to actually release between each one. Otherwise, no wonder we're walking around with our pelvic floors constantly gripping and tight, because we never actually had the time to release our pelvic floor.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It makes so much sense. And I think it all comes back to reframing the pelvic floor in a much more normalized way. It really is a muscle like any other muscle. And I guess because I see so many pelvic floors, vaginas, vulvas, it's very normal for me. But the more we discuss it, the more we talk about it as a normal muscle, as a muscle that needs attention, if we want it toned and looking and feeling good, then we've got to think about isolating some time. And we're talking a few minutes here. We're not talking like half an hour to do your pelvic floor exercises, but isolating some time that works for you. And I had a lady in the clinic yesterday, and she said to me, I really feel like I'm letting myself down because I've been told that I have to do 10 reps of 10-second holds and 10 fast reps first thing in the morning, standing up. And I just can't find any time to make that happen. And I said to her, oh my goodness, that's kind of, if you like, the gold standard message that's being sent out there.
The dream.
The dream. I don't do my pelvic floor exercises standing up first thing in the morning. Oh my gosh, I wish I did. The reality is that doesn't work with my lifestyle. My kids are running around at the first thing in the morning. So you have to find a time that works for you. I often do them at lunchtime when I'm having my lunch break, making a cup of tea, because that works for me. But I also have a pelvic floor that's strong enough to allow me to do a bit of multitasking as well. When you first start out, you do have to just pay it that little bit of attention, but do it at the time that works for you. And if you can't get 10 reps of 10-second holds and 10 fast done at that time, first of all, it might be too much for your pelvic floor anyway. But second of all, doing some is better than doing none. And going for quality over quantity is much more important than squeezing a few out on the train, which you got to be pretty damn good to do that, because I find that really hard on the train, quite frankly. And there's just too much going on. So just try and find 2 or 3 minutes and make it part of your daily routine. Just as we found time in our day to brush our teeth twice a day, and it is cliched, but it's the reality. It is as important as brushing your teeth, but at a time that suits you and works for you.
Yeah. And doing it on the train or doing it in public in general. I mean, we all have that pelvic floor face, don't we? Everyone will know. You're going,
Yeah.
So we've touched really briefly on the whole 10 holds, 10 pulses. Let's talk a bit about, so what does a pelvic floor sort of mini routine look like, and why are we doing holds and pulses?
Yeah, so your pelvic floor is made up of 70% slow twitch fibres. And those muscle fibres are used more if you're desperate for the toilet and you've got to hold it in for a little while. So that's where we'll ask for those muscles to work, or those parts of the muscle to work a little bit harder. 30% of the pelvic floor is made of fast twitch fibres. So that might be when we cough quickly or run for the bus. Those fast twitch fibres are more likely to kick in. So that's why we suggest that you hold the pelvic floor for X amount of time, but you also squeeze your pelvic floor quickly so that you're addressing and strengthening both parts of the pelvic floor. We say 10-second holds because that is what the research is suggesting is a good amount of hold to really adapt the pelvic floor to cope with everyday living, everyday tasks. But you've got to remember that when we say 10-second holds 10 times and 10 quick squeezes, that's what you're aiming towards. That's not necessarily where you might start, okay? And I think that's where I see some people come unstuck, because they come into clinic and they say, oh God, I can't hold my pelvic floor for 10 seconds, and I definitely can't do that 10 times. And I think it's really important to, again, go back to a normal muscle. That's almost like saying, right, deadlift 50 kg. Okay, that's what you're aiming for, but you might start deadlifting just a 1 kilogram weight. So therefore, you might just start with a 2-second hold and maybe carry that out a few times as opposed to 10 times. But that's where that individualized approach comes from. And that is where you might really find that call hard to make when you're on your own looking at an app, for example. And the Squeezy app is the app I would recommend as a reminder to do your pelvic floor exercises and educate yourself as to how to do your pelvic floor exercises. But it starts at the top, the Squeezy app, and you can change it and lower it down. But that's where that individualized approach with the help of a pelvic health physio can really, really help, because we'll start you at a point that your pelvic floor can really cope with, but really adapt with as well. And then you've got to think about the position you do your pelvic floor exercises as well. So if you've just had your baby, and I'm talking in the past few days, few weeks, you might want to start doing your pelvic floor exercises lying on your side. I always think that's a nice position to start, because it's just a nice way to reconnect with that area. Because when you've had a baby, that brain to pelvic floor connection can sometimes be a little bit confused. So lying on your side, eliminating gravity and body weight is a great place to start. But then over time, and I'm talking only a few weeks, we really want to start progressing you into more functional positions. So sitting is a great place to then flip to. And again, that's a bit more body weight, a bit more gravity. It's a little bit harder to do your pelvic floor squeezes in that position. But ideally, where we want to end you up in is standing. But if you've ever tried a pelvic floor exercise, not having done one before, standing's a really hard place to start. So that's what we're aiming for, but it's okay not to start there. It's a nice place to end, though.
And I think it's really important to remind people as well that they are supposed to feel hard. Like any other muscle in the body, it gets stronger if it's overloaded. It needs to get to the point where it's thinking, crikey, I just don't think I can do another rep. And I think sometimes when women are doing their pelvic floor exercises and they're experiencing that sensation, they think, oh my gosh, my pelvic floor must be really weak. And it's quite demoralizing. It doesn't make you want to do it anymore. But actually, it's remembering that you want it to feel like at the end of this, you're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to do any more holds or squeezes. And it's not a reflection on your ability. It's that to get your pelvic floor stronger, it does need to be challenged, and it should feel hard by the end.
Definitely. And I think that's why a lot of women don't necessarily see those changes happen, possibly because they're not stressing or loading their pelvic floor enough. And it's just not something that you can necessarily know. I think a really good play, if you're symptomatic with pelvic floor issues, if you try your pelvic floor exercises for about 4 to 6 weeks and you start seeing an improvement in your symptoms, you're probably bang on track and doing a really good job yourself. If you're symptomatic and you're still doing that and nothing's changing after about 4 to 6 weeks, that's really where you need to think about approaching a professional, because that's possibly just your technique's a bit off, or possibly you're not loading your pelvic floor enough, or possibly you're not relaxing your pelvic floor. There's lots of things that we as clinicians need to consider to help you optimize your pelvic floor rehab.
Mm-hmm. So during pregnancy, really throughout life, but particularly during pregnancy, what we want to be doing is daily trying to aim for 10 holds for up to 10 seconds, 10 squeezes, with good technique in different positions where possible. So, because we don't only ever cough when we're sat cross-legged, thinking about our pelvic floor. And, hopefully that's enough to kind of stay on top. In an ideal world, we'd come into pregnancy with an already very functional pelvic floor. But as we've discussed, that might not be the case for lots of women. So staying on top of those pelvic floor exercises, or sometimes called Kegels, during pregnancy will hopefully make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
And asking to be referred if you are starting to notice some of those symptoms you mentioned.
Yeah, 100%.
So I think next, let's talk about what happens during labour then. Obviously, we're talking about vaginal births. So I just want to caveat this with, I had a C-section, you've had C-sections as well. So we've got no preference to how people give birth.
No.
But obviously the pelvic floor goes through the biggest changes if someone's had a vaginal birth. So what happens during labour?
So during labour, as the uterus is contracting, the pelvic floor ideally should be relaxing, and it lengthens from its resting position. It gets about 250 times bigger than its original resting state. So that's why labour, in theory, should take time, because it allows that pelvic floor and the cervix to open slowly with enough tension to not create too much stretch on the system. Now, obviously, some women have a really quick labour, and that sounds amazing, doesn't it? But that actually can, be quite traumatic to the pelvic floor, because it hasn't got time to go from a resting state to 250 times its normal resting state. Hasn't got much time to do that. So I always think of it like an elastic band. If you've got an elastic band and you're really slowly pulling it, that's really kind to the elastic band. If all of a sudden you're just suddenly pinging it really hard, that is where that can just cause a little bit of stretch and a little bit of trauma to the pelvic floor. That doesn't mean to say you're going to have any pelvic floor issues, but even women who have had a quick labour, who haven't got any pelvic floor issues when they have their baby, they need to be mindful of the fact that they really should be rehabbing their pelvic floor. Like anyone who's had a baby should be rehabbing their pelvic floor. So the pelvic floor has to go through an awful lot of change during a vaginal delivery. And then, of course, it might be exposed to an episiotomy. An episiotomy is a surgical cut that is made to help some babies enter the world with greater ease, simply because that area needs a little bit more stretch than is happening to it at that time. Some women, unfortunately, will experience an instrumental delivery, so forceps or ventouse, when they have an episiotomy to help guide baby out as well. And those instrumental deliveries often cause a bit of trauma to the pelvic floor as well. So big emphasis there on having some rehab after you've delivered baby instrumentally. Some women will deliver baby vaginally and have none of these interventions, which is the ideal. Or they may deliver baby and unfortunately experience a tear as well. And I would say, if you're having a vaginal delivery the first time, it's very unlikely that there won't be an element of grazing or cutting or tearing to that tissue, because it's never been stretched to that extent before. So please don't be fearful of that. That is, I guess, partly a natural process. But what we really want to avoid is any grand tear happening. So we can ideally experience a bit of grazing or cutting, or a grade 1 tear, maybe a grade 2 where there's a little bit more tearing around the vaginal perineal area. But what we want to avoid is any grade 3 or grade 4 tear, where a tear occurs in towards the anal sphincter. And midwives and doctors are getting better and better at helping reduce that happening, often by supporting the perineal area as you birth. But we also see that if we do carry out things like perineal massage, prior to having a baby, so from around about 35 weeks of pregnancy, then that can help reduce any chances of third or fourth degree tears. So it's important to try and carry out perineal massage. I know you've got videos and blogs on the Bump Plan about that, but perineal massage has been shown to be effective in helping reduce that happen. So the whole pelvic floor goes through an awful lot, and it's going to be uncomfortable initially when you've delivered baby vaginally for those reasons. But it's important that once you've had a baby vaginally and you have no catheter in place, if you had one in place, that you start your pelvic floor exercises, because pelvic floor exercises are going to get blood to the area. They're going to help heal that area, and you'll see a quicker improvement in your recovery and hopefully a reduction in your pain if you start short squeezes little and often throughout the day as soon as you feel ready to go.
Yeah, that's really good advice, because there is, obviously working with lots and lots of pregnant and postnatal people, same as yourself. I have heard lots of different things where somebody has had a midwife say, don't do your pelvic floor exercises because you've got a tear, and a lot of misinformation. But actually, like you said, unless you have a catheter in place and unless it's unbearably painful, doing your pelvic floor exercises can start essentially immediately and can be really beneficial.
Yeah, it really can. And the other thing to think about
also, if you've had a...
Oh, sorry, Holly.
No, you go.
I'm so sorry.
You're the expert. Go.
No, I was just going to say the other thing you might experience, because we've got to think about the back passage as well, is hemorrhoids or piles. When you're thinking about pushing as baby is delivered, that can put some strain on the rectal veins around the back passage as well. So piles and hemorrhoids are really common after having a vaginal delivery. And one of the things that can help resolve those is pelvic floor exercises, squeezing the pelvic floor, getting blood to the area, and just drawing that venous system back up is really helpful as well. So it's another plus for doing your pelvic floor exercises postnatally.
Yeah, it's a win-win. And what I was going to say as well is that, it's also really important to say that even if you've had a cesarean, you've just had 9-10 months of that increased load on your pelvic floor, which we talked about earlier on. So yes, it's incredible if you've had a vaginal birth, but actually we should all be doing our pelvic floor exercises as soon as we can, no matter how we give birth. So just do them, basically.
Yes, do them. No one is exempt.
No one gets to dip out of those. So we talked about the fact that the vagina, the pelvic floor is going to go through a fair amount during a vaginal birth, which is fair enough. Lots of those symptoms or those sensations of pain afterwards should ease off naturally over time. But what might be some of the kind of signs of concern or reasons why somebody might need to ask to be checked over postnatally, if things don't seem to be going back to where they were before?
Yeah, so in an ideal world, I would suggest everyone that's had a baby see a pelvic health physiotherapist. That would be my dream. Let's face it, that's not happening at the moment. Let's be honest. However, if you have had a third or fourth degree tear or a forceps delivery, regardless of whether or not you've got any symptoms of pelvic floor dysfunction, please ask to see a pelvic health physiotherapist, because those particular those particular insults to your pelvic floor, if you like, you do need to have rehab following that sort of delivery. So that's really important. But if you are experiencing symptoms of urinary leakage, urinary urgency, fecal incontinence, heaviness, bulging in the vagina, as I said earlier, any pelvic pain or any pain at all when you're having sex or any problems opening your bowels, they are the signs and symptoms that your pelvic floor needs a little bit more attention than if you have no symptoms at all. But as we get older and we go into the perimenopause, and that is going to happen to us all, and let me tell you, it's quite the adventure. When that does happen, your pelvic floor loves estrogen, okay? And estrogen is a hormone that depletes when you hit the perimenopause. When you've had a baby, vaginally or via C-section, as we've already touched on, that pelvic floor has been a little bit weakened, lengthened, compromised. So sometimes when you hit that time in life, because you haven't got quite the amount of hormone that you need, that weakness or that compromise to that symptom, you become more aware of it. So you can then become symptomatic of pelvic floor dysfunction, a little more so than potentially women who haven't had a baby. So again, we're thinking proactive, preventative, hence why I'm saying that every woman needs to see a pelvic health physiotherapist, or at least do their pelvic floor exercises with or without symptom, because we're trying to stave off what might happen later in life that is inevitable for any woman with or without children. And therefore, if we know that these symptoms can happen, isn't it sensible just to try and stop them happening before they come along?
Yeah. And also I think, into pregnancy period, if you've just had a child and you're thinking that you're going to have another child again in the future, it's really worth getting that pelvic floor strong and functional again ahead of going into your next pregnancy, because pregnancy can be a factor in your pelvic floor struggling. So I often say to clients, really try and use this time before you get pregnant again to go into pregnancy strong.
Yeah, exactly right. I'm all for that.
So we've kind of we've talked about the fact that we might notice things like urinary incontinence. You talked about lots of the symptoms of pelvic floor dysfunction. I feel like it might be worth going into prolapse slightly more, because often with the symptom of the bulging or the heaviness in the vagina, postnatal members will often say, I don't know what's normal, I've just given birth out of my vagina. So could you maybe talk a bit about why that is a symptom that we would be worried about, and what a prolapse is?
Yeah, so a pelvic organ prolapse, or a POP, as you'll quite often see on social media, is essentially where a pelvic organ has descended onto the vaginal wall. So the vaginal walls support our pelvic organ. So the front vaginal wall supports our bladder, the back supports our bowel, and the top supports our cervix or our uterus. So when often you've had baby, what can happen, unfortunately, if the pelvic floor becomes a bit weak or the tissue above becomes a bit stretched, those tissues can just start descending towards the vaginal walls and causing some bulging in that area. Typically, the first 6 weeks after having a baby vaginally, you may experience some heaviness anyway, because everything's swollen and uncomfortable in that area often. And so I wouldn't overthink it for the first few weeks. However, if you start noticing that you're feeling some heaviness in that area, or like a dragging sensation, lots of women describe it, it feels like I've got a tampon inside my vagina, but I haven't got a tampon in there. That's a pretty typical symptom that might be described. Some women who look at their vulva will see a bulging, almost like some tissue in the vaginal opening, or like a little tennis ball in that area, or just a little ball in that area that doesn't look like it did before you have baby. And again, should really definitely say, try and have a look at your vulva during or before you've had a baby, because that's really, really helpful to know what your normal is. If you are experiencing any of those symptoms, then it's well worth getting that assessed and looked into, simply because for most women, they will have, or they may have, a small element of change within those vaginal walls, small element of bulging. And with the right rehab, we can definitely help address that stretch and change in tissue, and certainly reduce your symptoms. We might not necessarily always change the look, because that tissue around the vagina has been stretched, but we should be able to help you reduce your symptom of heaviness, dragging, or feeling of bulging in that area. Prolapses are graded, so we grade them from 0, which means you have no signs of prolapse, all the way up to 4. So a grade 4 prolapse, unfortunately, you will see a lot of tissue hanging out of the vagina, and so you'll be very aware that you have a significant prolapse because there'll be a lot of tissue hanging out of the vaginal area. But for most women, it's just a tiny little bit, and with a bit of rehab, we can get you an awful lot better, and hopefully for the majority of women allow for you to be symptom free. The big thing with prolapse is if you have a prolapse, we don't want it to get worse. So we want to make sure that we're getting you stronger and helping you to manage the exercise that you're doing so that we can stop any, long-term changes occurring that may then cause more discomfort and symptom. And I should just tell you the names of prolapse. So a bladder prolapse is called a cystocele, a back wall prolapse or bowel prolapse is called a rectocele, and a uterine prolapse is called a uterine prolapse. So you may experience one of the walls prolapsing, you may experience in two of them, you may experience all three of them. And there's a lot of scaremongering around pelvic organ prolapse. Long gone are the days now where we say never lift baby again, never lift more than baby weight again, never run again. There is so much we can do to help improve symptoms of pelvic organ prolapse, and I cannot emphasize that enough. And if you have a pelvic organ prolapse, you should definitely see a pelvic health physiotherapist before you really see anyone else. We are the first rung of the ladder in terms of what intervention might be needed. And for most women, a good bit of pelvic health physiotherapist makes the world of difference. And within a few months, you just feel so much better. That was my whistle stop tour.
Yeah, no, I think it's all we need to know right now, at the end of the day, how it feels, how it happens, and that there is support out there. With regards to being referred to a pelvic health physio, we've touched on it a few times today. Obviously, if there's any of the warning signs that we talked about or signs of concern, do it if you have the funds, which we'll touch on in a minute, to do it postnatally. As we've said, if we could gift any new mum anything, it'd be a pelvic health physio appointment. And in France, I know they've got great pelvic health physio aftercare for free. But in the UK, your options are some areas you can self-refer, some areas are online, I believe. Some areas you would need to speak to your doctor and occasionally really push to be referred, or if funds allow, you can see somebody privately, where obviously there is a fee associated, but it might not be that you need multiple appointments. Is that an accurate description?
Yes, spot on. You may only need to see us once, you may need to see us a couple of times, but I appreciate with the increased cost of living and mat pay being generally for most of us not very good, it is an expense, but I think it's possibly one of the best spends of money if you've got it in the pot. But saying all that, you really can access us via the NHS. The only thing is, since COVID, the waiting lists are really long, but stick on the waiting list. Even if your symptoms get better, unfortunately they can return, so stick on that waiting list, and definitely go for that appointment, because it really can make such a difference to your long-term pelvic health, if nothing else.
And you can find a directory of pelvic health physios through the Squeezy app as well, can't you?
Yeah, Squeezy app directory is amazing, and POGP also has a directory as well. So there will be someone close-ish to you. It's just sometimes a case of exploring that a little using those directories.
Perfect. Well, I hope that everyone listening has kind of come away from this understanding the importance of doing your pelvic floor exercises. As Emma said, this is not to scare anybody. We don't want anyone going away from this thinking, oh my gosh, if I have a vaginal birth, this is going to happen. I'm going to end up with a prolapse. It's essentially saying, these are kind of the worst case scenarios. These are some of the things that could happen. But, at whatever stage in your pregnancy or recovery you are right now, start your pelvic floor exercises unless you've been told not to, because for most of those symptoms, they're going to make a huge difference. And if you're concerned, press your doctor to refer you to someone amazing like Emma, and it can make a huge difference.
Beautiful.
Anything I've missed, Emma?
No, you summarised that perfectly.
Perfect. Anything that we haven't mentioned that you wanted to mention today, or have we covered most of it?
I think the only other thing to think about is, you may have touched on this with other guests as well, is just your return to exercise postnatally. You do need to think about, those symptoms of pelvic floor dysfunction. So if you're experiencing those symptoms that we've discussed, before you go back to higher impact exercise, so running or any of your HIIT classes, try and aim to be symptom-free before you do those, because often those sorts of exercises will make your symptoms worse. And if you just can't get on top of it, then see someone like myself, or start your pelvic floor program or the postnatal bump plan, obviously, to get strong before you return to those more demanding sports which do stress your pelvic floor. So you've got to have a really good strong pelvic floor before you start thinking of those sports.
Yeah, that's really important. Thanks, Emma. Well, I think that is everything. So I hope that everyone's found that really helpful. I'm going to be here when we've logged off doing my pelvic floor exercises, because again, I'm not letting what happened last time happen again. And Emma, thank you so much for always being amazing and all your amazing insight.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Holly.
Thanks, Emma. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Firstly, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode of Bun in the Oven, and I hope you found it helpful. For more support, do head to the show notes below to find links and supplementary reading we feel may be helpful to you. Secondly, this podcast can only help those who know about it. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean so much if you could give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. While podcasts are easy to listen to, they take a lot of effort to create, and your support in sharing Bun in the Oven will help me encourage more guests to join me for future episodes. Thank you so much for watching today, and enjoy the rest of your day.